Rudolf Steiner's hands shook as he stared at the envelope on his bunk, postmarked from Bavaria and bearing his mother's handwriting, a script he thought he would never see again. 6 weeks earlier, an American guard had walked into the barracks at the Texas POW camp carrying boxes of paper, pencils, and envelopes, announcing that prisoners could write home. Rudolf had laughed bitterly, certain it was a trick, some new form of psychological torture. But now, holding proof that his mother was alive, that she had received his letter and written back, Rudolf felt something break open inside his chest. Around him, other German prisoners were reading their own letters, and grown men were weeping without shame. How had their enemy given them back something so precious, something they believed had been lost forever? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The journey to this moment had begun 4 months earlier, in the cold February of 1945, when Rudolf Steiner first arrived at Camp Swift in Central Texas. He was 26 years old, a former sergeant in the Wehrmacht who had been captured during the Battle of the Bulge. The transport across the Atlantic had been miserable, crowded below decks with hundreds of other German soldiers, all of them sick with fear about what awaited them in America. Rudolf had heard the propaganda, the warnings about how the Americans would treat prisoners, and though he tried not to believe the worst of it, he couldn't help but prepare himself for cruelty. He had been away from home for 3 years, fighting in a war he had never wanted, watching friends die in frozen fields, and now he was being carried across an ocean to a land he knew nothing about. When the trucks rolled through the gates of Camp Swift, Rudolf felt his stomach tighten with anxiety. The camp stretched across flat Texas grassland, a grid of barracks surrounded by wire fencing and guard towers. Everything looked stark and efficient, and Rudolf tried to read meaning into every detail, searching for clues about what kind of treatment they would receive. The guards who processed them were businesslike but not brutal, checking names against lists, assigning barracks numbers, handing out thin blankets and basic supplies. Rudolf was placed in Barracks 14 with 40 other men, most of them strangers to him, though a few faces were familiar from the transport ship. That first night, lying on his narrow bunk and listening to the sounds of men adjusting to their new reality, Rudolf allowed his thoughts to drift home to the small village outside Munich where he had grown up. He pictured his mother's kitchen, the worn wooden table where they had shared so many meals, the window that looked out onto the garden where she grew vegetables and flowers. He wondered if the house was still standing, if his mother was still alive, if his younger brother Franz had survived the war. The not knowing was the hardest part, the vast silence that had swallowed his old life. Rudolf had not heard from his family in over a year, not since the mail from home had stopped arriving at the front. For all he knew, they could be dead, the house could be rubble, everything he had once known could be gone. The days at Camp Swift settled into a rhythm that Rudolf found both monotonous and strangely calming. The prisoners were organized into work details, sent out each day to help with various tasks around the camp and in the surrounding area. Rudolf found himself assigned to a crew that worked on road repairs, filling potholes and clearing drainage ditches under the supervision of American guards who seemed perpetually bored by their assignment. The work was physical, but not particularly demanding. Nothing compared to the brutal conditions Rudolf had endured during the war. The Texas sun beat down on them with relentless intensity, and Rudolf learned to appreciate the brief moments of shade and the cool water they were given during breaks. Among the men in Rudolf's barracks was a young private named Werner, barely 19 years old, who had been drafted in the final months of the war and captured during his first week at the front. Werner had a boyish face that made him look even younger than his years, and he carried himself with a mixture of fear and bewildered innocence. He had grown up in a small town in Saxony, the son of a baker, and he spoke often of his parents and 3 sisters with a homesickness that seemed to consume him. Rudolf found himself taking Werner under his wing, offering small kindnesses and words of encouragement, though he felt like a hypocrite doing so when his own heart was just as heavy with loss and uncertainty. There was also Klaus, a former corporal from Berlin who had the hard eyes of a man who had seen too much. Klaus rarely spoke about his past, but when he did, his words carried the weight of genuine trauma. He had fought on the Eastern Front, had survived Stalingrad, had watched thousands of men die in ways that haunted his sleep. Klaus treated the POW camp with a grim pragmatism, following rules, keeping his head down, expecting nothing and therefore never disappointed. Rudolf respected Klaus's toughness, but found his cynicism depressing, a reminder of how the war had broken something fundamental in so many men. The American guards at Camp Swift were a varied group, and Rudolf learned quickly that their treatment of prisoners depended largely on individual personality rather than any unified policy. There was Corporal Jenkins, a farm boy from Oklahoma with a friendly demeanor who would sometimes share cigarettes and make small talk in broken German. There was Lieutenant Harrison, a stern disciplinarian who ran the camp with rigid efficiency but was never needlessly cruel. And then there was Private Marcus Webb, a young man from New York City who seemed genuinely curious about the German prisoners, asking questions about their lives and listening with what appeared to be sincere interest. It was Marcus Webb who would eventually become Rudolf's most frequent source of conversation. During the work details, when the guards were relaxed and the tasks were routine, Marcus would drift over to where Rudolf was working and strike up dialogue. He asked about Germany, about what life had been like before the war, about German food and music and customs. Rudolf was cautious at first, unsure of Marcus's motives, but over time he came to believe that the young American's interest was genuine. Marcus told Rudolf about growing up in Brooklyn, about working in his father's grocery store, about how he had enlisted after Pearl Harbor with dreams of adventure that had quickly faded into the reality of military life. One afternoon in early April, as Rudolf and his crew were taking a break from digging drainage ditches, Marcus sat down beside Rudolf in the shade of a scraggly mesquite tree and pulled out a letter from his jacket pocket. The envelope was worn and creased from being handled many times, and Marcus held it with a tenderness that made Rudolf's chest ache. Marcus explained that it was from his mother, who wrote to him every week without fail, filling pages with news about the neighborhood, updates about his younger siblings, reminders to stay safe and come home soon. Marcus's voice grew soft as he talked about how much those letters meant to him, how they were his lifeline to the world he had left behind, how reading his mother's words made him feel less alone. Rudolf listened with a growing pain in his throat, thinking about how long it had been since he had received any word from home. How desperately he wanted to know if his own mother was alive and safe. When Marcus finished speaking and tucked the letter carefully back into his pocket, Rudolf found himself asking a question that had been burning inside him for months. He asked Marcus if there was any way for prisoners to send or receive mail, any system in place that might allow them to contact their families. Marcus's expression grew thoughtful, and he admitted that he didn't know, but promised to ask his superiors about it. Rudolf didn't allow himself to hope, certain that even if such a system existed, it would never extend to enemy prisoners. But he thanked Marcus anyway for his willingness to inquire. 2 weeks passed, and Rudolf had largely forgotten about the conversation, dismissing it as another of the many small disappointments that made up life in captivity. Then, on a Tuesday morning in late April, something extraordinary happened. The prisoners in Barracks 14 were finishing their breakfast, preparing for another day of work, when Lieutenant Harrison entered with 2 guards carrying large cardboard boxes. The room fell silent as the men watched with wary curiosity, unsure what this unexpected visit might mean. Lieutenant Harrison set the boxes down on one of the empty bunks and cleared his throat, his expression businesslike, but not unkind. What he said next seemed to Rudolf like words from a dream. Lieutenant Harrison announced that the International Red Cross, in coordination with the U.S. military, had established a program allowing prisoners of war to send letters home to their families. The boxes contained paper, envelopes, and pencils that would be distributed to any prisoner who wished to write. The letters would be censored for security purposes, Lieutenant Harrison explained, and there could be no guarantee about when or if they would reach their destinations given the chaos in Europe, but the opportunity was being offered nonetheless. The rules were simple. Each prisoner could write 1 letter per month, keep the content focused on personal matters rather than military information, and understand that replies might take many weeks or even months to arrive if they came at all. For a long moment after Lieutenant Harrison finished speaking, nobody moved. The barracks remained frozen in stunned silence as 40 men tried to process what they had just been told. Rudolf felt his heart hammering in his chest, a wild mixture of hope and disbelief coursing through him. Around him, he could see other prisoners exchanging glances, their faces showing the same confusion and cautious excitement that he felt. It was Werner who broke the silence first, his young voice cracking as he asked if this was real, if they were truly being allowed to contact their families. Lieutenant Harrison nodded firmly, gesturing to the boxes, and said that any man who wanted to write should take what he needed. The rush toward the boxes was immediate and chaotic. Prisoners pushed forward, hands reaching for paper and pencils. Voices rising in a babble of German as men claimed their supplies and hurried back to their bunks. Rudolf found himself swept up in the movement, his hands closing around sheets of paper that felt impossibly precious, a pencil that seemed like a treasure beyond measure. He returned to his bunk in a daze, sitting down on the thin mattress and staring at the blank paper in his hands. After more than a year of silence, after months of not knowing whether his mother was alive or dead, Rudolf was being given the chance to reach across the void and try to make contact. But as he sat there with the pencil hovering over the paper, Rudolf found himself paralyzed by uncertainty. What should he write? How could he possibly compress everything he felt, everything he wanted to say, into a single letter? He didn't even know if his mother was still at the house in Bavaria, if she had survived the bombing raids and the advancing armies, if she would ever receive whatever words he managed to put down. The weight of all these unknowns pressed down on Rudolf until he felt like he couldn't breathe. Around him, other prisoners were having similar struggles, some writing furiously while others sat frozen like Rudolf, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the moment. It was Klaus who noticed Rudolf's paralysis and came over to sit beside him on the bunk. Klaus's weathered face was softer than usual, and when he spoke, his voice carried an unexpected gentleness. He told Rudolf that he understood the fear, the worry that hoping for contact might somehow be worse than accepting the silence, but that this opportunity was too precious to waste. Klaus admitted that he had no family left, that everyone he had known in Berlin was gone, but that didn't mean Rudolf should let his own chance slip away. He urged Rudolf to write whatever came from his heart, to trust that his mother would understand, to take this gift that the Americans were offering and use it before it disappeared. Rudolf nodded slowly, taking Klaus's words to heart, and forced himself to put pencil to paper. He started simply with the date and a greeting, and then the words began to flow more easily. He wrote about being captured, about the journey to America, about the camp in Texas and the treatment they received. He wrote about the men he had served with, about the friends who had not survived to see capture. He wrote about the relentless Texas heat and the strange landscape so different from Bavaria. But mostly, he wrote about how much he missed her, how he thought of her every day, how he prayed that she was safe and healthy. He asked about his brother Franz, about the house and the village, about whether she had enough food and warmth. He told her that he was uninjured and being treated fairly, that she should not worry about him, that he would survive this and come home when the war finally ended. The letter took Rudolf most of the morning to write, stopping and starting as he searched for the right words, crossing out phrases that didn't sound right, trying to strike a balance between honesty and reassurance. When he finally finished, he read through it twice, then carefully folded it and slid it into one of the envelopes. Writing his mother's address on the front felt both familiar and strange, the letters forming a connection to a place that seemed impossibly distant. He added his own name and barracks number as instructed, then sat holding the envelope and wondering if he was foolish to hope that it would ever reach its destination. That afternoon, Lieutenant Harrison returned to collect the letters. Prisoner after prisoner handed over their carefully written envelopes, and Rudolf noticed that many of the men had tears in their eyes as they surrendered these precious documents. Rudolf added his own letter to the growing pile, watching as it disappeared among dozens of others, and felt a flutter of anxiety in his stomach. What if it got lost? What if the address was no longer valid? What if his mother never knew that he had tried to reach her? But there was nothing more he could do now except wait and hope. The days that followed were strange for Rudolf. Having written the letter, having opened that door to the possibility of contact, he found that his emotional state had shifted in ways he hadn't anticipated. During the work details, his mind would drift to thoughts of his mother reading his words, imagining her reaction, wondering what she would write back if given the chance. At night, lying in his bunk, he would rehearse conversations in his head, things he would say if he could somehow speak to her directly. The waiting was excruciating, made worse by the uncertainty of whether anything would come of his effort. Werner had also written home, and the young private talked constantly about what his parents might say in reply, spinning elaborate fantasies about the letters he might receive. Rudolf found Werner's optimism both touching and painful, knowing how easily those hopes could be crushed by the harsh realities of a world torn apart by war. Klaus maintained his usual stoic demeanor, but Rudolf noticed that he seemed to pay particular attention whenever mail was mentioned, as if some part of him still yearned for connection, despite his claims of having lost everyone. 3 weeks after the prisoners had been given the opportunity to write home, Lieutenant Harrison made another unexpected announcement during morning formation. He explained that the camp would be receiving incoming mail for prisoners, letters from families in Germany that had been processed through the Red Cross and military channels. However, he cautioned, the prisoners should not expect that everyone would receive correspondence. The mail system in Europe was severely disrupted. Many addresses were no longer valid due to destruction and displacement, and it might take months for any replies to make their way across the Atlantic. Those who did receive letters should consider themselves fortunate, and those who didn't should not give up hope that something might still arrive in the future. Rudolf's stomach twisted with anxiety as he listened to these words. The thought that some men might receive letters while others waited in vain seemed almost unbearably cruel. Yet, he understood the reality behind Lieutenant Harrison's warning. The war had destroyed so much, displaced so many people, that the odds of any letter successfully finding its recipient were probably small. Rudolf tried to prepare himself for disappointment, telling himself that even if nothing came, at least he had tried, at least he had sent his words out into the world. The day the first batch of mail arrived was one Rudolf would never forget. It was a Thursday in mid-May, the Texas sun blazing overhead as the prisoners returned from their work details, tired and sweaty and ready for the evening meal. As Rudolf's group approached the barracks, he noticed an unusual commotion. Prisoners gathering in clusters and talking in animated voices. His pulse quickened, and he hurried forward to find out what was happening. Inside Barracks 14, Lieutenant Harrison stood beside a canvas mail sack, holding a clipboard and calling out names. Rudolf's heart pounded so hard he thought it might burst through his ribs. He pushed into the crowded barracks, trying to hear over the excited voices of other prisoners. Lieutenant Harrison was methodically working through the list, reading each name clearly and waiting for the corresponding prisoner to step forward. When a name was called and a letter handed over, the recipient would clutch it like a sacred object, often with tears streaming down his face. Rudolf watched Werner receive a thick envelope from his parents, saw the young private's knees nearly buckle with emotion, and felt his own throat constrict with vicarious joy and desperate hope. Then he heard it. Lieutenant Harrison called out Rudolf Steiner, and for a heartbeat, Rudolf thought he had imagined it. But the lieutenant was looking around the room expectantly, the envelope in his hand. And Rudolf found himself moving forward on legs that felt like they might give way at any moment. He reached out and took the envelope, his fingers trembling so badly he nearly dropped it. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable, his mother's careful script, slightly shaky with age, but definitely hers. Rudolf stared at it in disbelief, unable to process that he was actually holding a letter from home, that his mother had received his words and written back, that she was alive. He stumbled back to his bunk, barely aware of his surroundings, clutching the letter to his chest. Around him, the barracks had transformed into a scene of raw emotion. Men were crying openly, some laughing through their tears, others sitting in stunned silence as they read words from home. Rudolf sat down heavily, his hands shaking as he carefully opened the envelope, terrified that he might somehow damage this precious thing. Inside were 2 sheets of paper covered in his mother's handwriting, and Rudolf had to blink away tears before he could focus enough to read. The letter was dated 3 weeks earlier, written from the same address in Bavaria where Rudolf had grown up. His mother wrote that she had received his letter, that she had wept with joy and relief to learn that he was alive and safe. She wrote about how the war had come to their village, how the house had survived though many others had not, how she had managed to keep going despite the fear and uncertainty. She wrote about his brother Franz, who had been wounded on the Eastern Front but had survived and was now recovering in a hospital in Munich. She wrote about the neighbors, about who had died and who had endured, about the garden she still tended even though food was scarce. But mostly, she wrote about how much she loved him, how she had prayed for his safety every single day, how knowing that he was alive had given her strength to keep going. She urged him to stay strong, to take care of himself, to remember that he had a home and a family waiting for him. She promised to write again, said that she would send letters every month if she was allowed, that she would never stop trying to stay connected to him. The words blurred on the page as Rudolf's tears fell onto the paper, and he had to keep wiping his eyes to continue reading. When he finally finished, Rudolf sat clutching the letter and letting the tears flow freely down his face. Around him, other men were in similar states, the barracks filled with the sounds of weeping and occasional bursts of relieved laughter. Werner was sitting on his bunk reading his letter over and over, his face glowing with happiness. Even Klaus, stoic Klaus, was sitting alone in the corner with his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking in a way that suggested he was crying for all the letters he would never receive. Rudolf read his mother's letter 3 more times that evening, memorizing every word, every loop of her handwriting, every detail she had shared. He felt as though a weight he hadn't fully realized he'd been carrying had been lifted from his chest. The not knowing had been a constant ache, a background pain that colored everything, and now that pain had been replaced with the sweet relief of certainty. His mother was alive. Franz was alive. Their home still stood. The future remained uncertain, but at least Rudolf now knew that there was something real to hope for, something concrete to survive for. That night, the atmosphere in the barracks was unlike anything Rudolf had experienced since arriving at Camp Swift. Men who had been withdrawn and silent for months were talking animatedly, sharing news from their letters, asking questions about each other's families. There was laughter, genuine laughter, echoing through the wooden building. Some prisoners who had not received letters looked on with sadness, but even they seemed affected by the general mood of hope and connection. Rudolf found himself telling Werner and several others about his mother's letter, about the news of Franz's survival, about the house that had endured. In sharing his joy, Rudolf found it multiplied, expanded into something larger than his individual relief. Marcus Webb stopped by the barracks that evening, making his rounds as one of the guards on duty, and Rudolf called out to him through the window. When Marcus approached, Rudolf thanked him profusely, explaining that it was their conversation weeks ago that had prompted Marcus to inquire about male privileges, and that Rudolf now held a letter from his mother because of that inquiry. Marcus looked genuinely pleased, his young face breaking into a wide smile. He said he was glad to have helped, that he had talked to Lieutenant Harrison about the possibility after their conversation, and that he was happy to see how much the letters meant to the prisoners. The following weeks brought more letters, not for everyone, but for enough men that the mood in the camp shifted noticeably. The prisoners who received mail seemed to carry themselves differently, with a renewed sense of purpose and connection to the world beyond the wire. Rudolf received a second letter from his mother in early June, this one including a brief note from Franz, who was still recovering but improving steadily. Reading his brother's words, seeing his familiar handwriting, Rudolf felt tears spring to his eyes again. He had not cried this much since he was a child, but something about these letters cracked open emotions he had kept locked away for years. Rudolf began writing back regularly, 1 letter per month as allowed, carefully composing his words to provide reassurance while being honest about his experiences. He wrote about the other prisoners, about the strange landscape of Texas, about the small kindnesses shown by guards like Marcus Webb. He wrote about his hopes for the future, about his dreams of returning home when the war finally ended, about how much he looked forward to sitting at their kitchen table again. He never mentioned the nightmares that still woke him some nights, the memories of combat that haunted the edges of his consciousness, the ways in which the war had changed him. Those were burdens he would carry himself, things he would not place upon his mother's shoulders. The letters became a lifeline, not just for Rudolf, but for dozens of prisoners in the camp. Men who had been sinking into despair found reasons to hope again. The connection to home, fragile though it was, reminded them that they were more than just captives, more than just defeated soldiers. They were sons and brothers, husbands and fathers, men with identities that extended beyond the war. This simple act, this allowance to send and receive mail, had given them back a piece of their humanity. One evening in late June, as Rudolf sat on his bunk rereading his mother's latest letter, Klaus approached and sat down beside him. The older man's face carried an expression Rudolf had never seen before, something vulnerable and almost shy. Klaus explained that he had been wrong earlier when he said he had no family left. He had a sister in Hamburg, someone he hadn't spoken to in years due to a family conflict he no longer even fully remembered. Klaus had assumed she was dead, had told himself it didn't matter because their relationship had been broken anyway. But watching Rudolf and the others receive letters, seeing the joy and hope it brought, Klaus had begun to wonder if perhaps his sister might have survived, if there might be a chance for reconciliation. Rudolf encouraged Klaus to write to his sister, to take the chance while it was available, to not let old grievances prevent him from seeking connection. Klaus nodded slowly, admitting that he was afraid that she wouldn't respond or that she might reject his attempt to reach out, but that he thought Rudolf was right about trying. The next morning, Klaus was among the prisoners who requested writing materials, and Rudolf watched as the gruff older man hunched over his bunk, laboring over words that clearly didn't come easily to him. 6 weeks later, Klaus received a reply. His sister had survived the bombing of Hamburg, had lost her husband, but her children were safe, and she wrote that she had never stopped loving her brother despite their estrangement. Klaus's transformation, after reading that letter, was remarkable. The hard shell he had built around himself cracked open, and underneath was a man capable of tenderness and hope. He began writing to his sister regularly, and he spoke often about his plans to visit her and his nieces and nephews when he finally returned to Germany. Rudolf felt proud to have encouraged Klaus to take that chance, to have played even a small role in helping another man find connection. As summer turned toward fall, Rudolf's correspondence with his mother continued. Each letter brought news from home, updates about Franz's recovery, stories about the changing seasons in Bavaria. Rudolf's mother wrote about the challenges of the post-war period, the shortages and difficulties, but also about the small signs of recovery and hope. She wrote about neighbors returning from the war, about fields being replanted, about life slowly reasserting itself despite all the destruction. Rudolf read these letters with a mixture of homesickness and gratitude, painful to be reminded of what he was missing, but grateful to know that something remained to return to. The war in Europe had ended in May, but the prisoners at Camp Swift remained in American custody as arrangements were made for repatriation. The process was slow, complicated by the massive logistical challenges of moving millions of displaced people across a devastated continent. Rudolf and the others waited with growing impatience, eager to return home, but resigned to the pace of bureaucracy. During this waiting period, the letters became even more important, the primary connection to the lives they would eventually resume. In September, Rudolf received news that his repatriation would likely occur sometime in the early months of 1946. The timeline felt impossibly distant, but at least it was something concrete to hold on to. He wrote to his mother about this news, asking her to be patient a little longer, promising that he would come home as soon as he was allowed. Her reply, when it arrived weeks later, was filled with joy at knowing that their reunion was finally on the horizon. She wrote that she had already begun preparing for his return, cleaning his old room, planning meals she would cook for him, imagining the moment when he would walk through the door. As the months passed and Rudolf waited for his turn to be shipped home, he often reflected on the unexpected kindness that had been shown to him and his fellow prisoners. The Americans could have treated them far worse, could have denied them any contact with home, could have acted out of vengeance or cruelty. Instead, they had recognized the basic human need for connection, had facilitated these precious links between prisoners and their families, had treated defeated enemies with a dignity that Rudolf had not expected. This experience would shape how Rudolf viewed his former enemies for the rest of his life, teaching him that even in war, even between adversaries, there could be moments of grace and compassion. Werner was among the first from their barracks to be repatriated, leaving in November of 1945. The night before his departure, he thanked Rudolf for his friendship and guidance, for helping him survive the fear and uncertainty of captivity. Rudolf embraced the young man, told him to go home to his family and live a good life, to let the war stay in the past where it belonged. After Werner left, the barracks felt emptier, and Rudolf realized how much he had come to care for these men he had been thrown together with by circumstance. Klaus's turn came in early December. Before he left, he found Rudolf and shook his hand firmly, his eyes bright with emotion. Klaus said that Rudolf had given him back something he thought he'd lost forever, the belief that connection and love were still possible after everything they had been through. He promised to write once he was settled back in Hamburg, to let Rudolf know how his reunion with his sister had gone. Rudolf watched Klaus board the truck that would take him to the ship, feeling a mixture of happiness for his friend and sadness at saying goodbye. Rudolf's own repatriation finally came in late January of 1946. The night before his departure, he sat in the nearly empty barracks, most of the men from Barracks 14 having already left for home, and wrote one final letter to his mother. He told her that he was coming home, that by the time she received this letter, he would likely already be on his way, that their long separation was nearly over. He thanked her for her letters, for keeping him connected to home during the long months of captivity, for giving him hope when he needed it most. He promised that he would spend the rest of his life trying to be worthy of her love and faith. The journey back across the Atlantic was long, the ship crowded with returning prisoners, but Rudolf barely noticed the discomfort. His thoughts were entirely focused on what lay ahead, on the reunion with his mother and brother, on the life he would rebuild from the ruins of war. He kept his mother's letters with him, tucked safely in his jacket pocket, a tangible reminder of the connection that had sustained him through the darkest times. When Rudolf finally arrived back in Bavaria in mid-February of 1946, walking the familiar roads toward his village, he felt as though he was moving through a dream. The landscape was scarred by war, buildings damaged or destroyed, but the essential shape of the place remained recognizable. As he approached his mother's house, his heart pounding with anticipation, he saw her standing in the doorway, as if she had been watching for him. The moment their eyes met, Rudolf began to run, and then he was in her arms. Both of them crying and laughing, holding each other as if they would never let go. That evening, sitting at the kitchen table he had dreamed about so often, Rudolf pulled out the stack of letters his mother had sent him during his time in the POW camp. He told her how much they had meant to him, how they had been his lifeline to hope, how they had reminded him that love could survive even the worst that war could inflict. His mother reached across the table and took his hand, tears streaming down her weathered face, and said that she had felt the same way about his letters, that they had given her the strength to keep going when everything seemed darkest. Rudolf would keep those letters for the rest of his life, storing them carefully in a wooden box in his room. In the years that followed, whenever doubt or despair crept into his mind, whenever the memories of war threatened to overwhelm him, Rudolf would take out those letters and read them again, reminding himself of what had been preserved despite everything. The simple act of being allowed to write home, of receiving replies from his mother, had been one of the most profound gifts Rudolf ever received. It taught him that even in the midst of war, even between enemies, there existed the possibility of recognizing each other's humanity, of offering kindness across the divide of conflict. The story of those letters became something Rudolf shared with his own children years later, when they were old enough to understand, a testament to the power of connection and the importance of treating all people with dignity, even in the darkest of times. Rudolf told them about the American guards who had facilitated the mail program, about Marcus Webb, who had listened to a prisoner's question and cared enough to seek answers, about the simple miracle of words traveling across an ocean to link hearts that had been severed by war. It was a story about hope, about the resilience of love, about how the smallest acts of kindness could resonate far beyond their immediate moment. And every time Rudolf told that story, he felt again the weight of that first envelope in his trembling hands, the impossible joy of his mother's handwriting, the moment when he realized he was not alone after all.